What happens when one of the world's most beloved actors walks into what's supposed to be a lighthearted interview, only to discover that the host across from him came with a knife behind his smile? That night wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a lesson in poise, dignity, and just how far some people will go for a headline. And by the end of it, a packed studio would fall dead silent, a man would walk off stage, and millions would finally see the truth behind the mask. But let's rewind to how it began. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert was buzzing that evening. Social media was ablaze. Johnny Depp's comeback interview. He's finally back on late night. After years of brutal headlines, courtroom dramas, and relentless media warfare, Johnny's appearance was hyped as a cultural moment, one of healing, redemption, and a return to form. He walked onto that stage like only Johnny Depp can, charisma oozing from every step, rings glinting under the lights, vintage jacket draped casually over his frame, like he'd just stepped off a pirate ship and into Manhattan. The audience erupted, a standing ovation before he even spoke. Cheers, whistles, applause. And then, the quiet smirk, that unmistakable crooked smile. He sat down, crossed his legs, leaned back. Stephen Colbert welcomed him with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said dramatically, "joining us tonight is a man who's been through more trials than a Supreme Court judge, Johnny Depp." Laughter, but it wasn't entirely warm. Johnny raised an eyebrow, let out a half laugh. "Well, we're starting spicy, aren't we?" Stephen leaned forward. Hey, I kid. We're friends here, right? Just two guys having a safe conversation. Safe. Totally safe." The crowd laughed, unsure if they should. Johnny nodded. "Safe. That's an interesting word, Stephen." What followed was, for a brief moment, ordinary. The script kicked in. Stephen asked about Johnny's new indie film. Johnny talked about storytelling, connecting through characters, loving the rawness of smaller projects. But Colbert wasn't listening. Not really. He was waiting, coiled. Then it came. "So," Stephen began casually, tapping his notes, "we've seen you fight pirates. We've seen you fight the press. What's next, a cage match with your ex?" Laughter again, but this time more forced. Johnny blinked once. "Is that what we're doing, Stephen?" "Oh, come on," Colbert chuckled. "You've got to admit, you're a walking TMZ segment. I mean, you show up and suddenly every publicist in Hollywood clutches their pearls." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Johnny's jaw twitched, but he kept calm. "Well," he said slowly, "I find that it's usually the insecure who reach for cheap shots." Colbert's grin tightened. "Oh, you wound me, Daw. But seriously, Johnny, don't you think some of the backlash you've faced is self-inflicted? I mean, there's been a lot of smoke. Are you saying there was never a fire?" The studio chilled instantly. Johnny didn't blink. "I'm saying people love bonfires," he said coolly, "especially when they think someone else is burning in it." Stephen tried to laugh. It came out wrong. "You're dodging the question, my man." "No, Stephen," Johnny replied, leaning forward. "I'm dodging the trap." And just like that, the energy shifted. The audience leaned in. What was supposed to be a comeback turned into a duel. And Johnny wasn't playing by late-night rules. Stephen doubled down. "You can't deny the chaos around you. Lawsuits, delays, on-set walkouts. I mean, at what point do you look in the mirror and think, maybe I'm the problem?" Gasps from the crowd, a few murmurs. Johnny stared at him, long, calm, unbothered. "I do look in the mirror," he said, "often, but I don't confuse reflection with projection." Colbert's smirk flickered. "You came here to talk about your film," he said, flipping a card. "But let's be honest, people care more about what you are than what you do. You're a symbol now, Johnny. A cautionary tale, maybe." "You're mistaking character for caricature," Johnny said, "which is ironic, coming from a man who plays one 5 nights a week." The crowd erupted. Laughter, applause, whoops. A few stood. Stephen blinked hard, caught off guard, and for the first time in the interview, he didn't know what to say. But that was just the beginning. Because in part 2, Johnny will turn the tide, and Stephen, cornered by his own ego, will begin to lose control. The tension in the studio was no longer subtext. It was alive, breathing, pulsing, rattling under the floorboards of late-night decorum. Stephen Colbert straightened his stack of cards, but he didn't look at them. He looked at Johnny. Not with curiosity, not even with mockery now, but with intent. "Well," Stephen said, his voice smoother than necessary, "since we're talking about reflections and projections, I have to ask, do you ever think maybe Hollywood didn't betray you? Maybe it just finally caught up with who you really are?" There it was. The room tensed as if bracing for impact. Johnny didn't flinch. He simply exhaled slowly. "You know, Stephen, I used to think cleverness was your strength. Now I'm starting to think it's your mask." Colbert let out a short laugh. "Come on, Johnny, don't turn this into therapy. This is a talk show." "Oh, I know what it is," Johnny said, eyes sharp. "It's a place where you dress mockery up as wit, hand it out to the audience like candy, and call it insight." The audience murmured. No laughter this time, just alertness. "You say you're just being honest," Johnny continued, "but honesty without compassion is cruelty, and you've made a career of it." That hit. Stephen's grin faltered, barely. But enough. He clapped his hands once. "Wow, that's poetic. You practicing that one in your trailer?" Johnny smiled slightly. "No, I just don't have a team of writers feeding me lines every night." Ouch. A few people in the audience laughed, nervous, sharp. Someone even whistled. The crowd was shifting. Colbert leaned forward. Okay, let's get real then. Johnny Depp, tell us, do you ever take responsibility for anything?" Johnny blinked slowly. "Do you?" That silence, it was longer than it had any right to be. "I ask because you sit behind a desk," Johnny went on, "throwing grenades at people who actually take risks. You hide behind applause signs and editing cuts. Meanwhile, you poke, prod, and provoke under the illusion of satire." Stephen leaned back, mouth slightly open. "And when someone finally stands up to you," Johnny continued, "you act like you're the one under attack." Colbert tried to regain control. "Listen, I'm just doing what people want. They want answers. They want the truth." Johnny's expression hardened. "They want humanity, something you've forgotten how to deliver." The air snapped like a rubber band. "You think this is about me being sensitive?" Johnny asked, rising slightly in his seat. "This is about you dressing up disrespect as entertainment. There's a difference." Stephen shifted, visibly uncomfortable now. "So now you're going to lecture me on morality? The guy who brought a suitcase full of wine to a deposition?" Some of the audience gasped. Others booed. A few shouted, "Too far." Johnny smiled coldly. "Oh, I see. We've reached the part where you stop pretending it's a joke." Stephen chuckled nervously. "You've got to admit you've been chaotic. And you've been cruel," Johnny said, his voice lowering. "And the difference between us is I own my scars. You pretend yours are wit." That line felt like the floor dropped out from under the studio. Stephen blinked fast, now clearly rattled. "This isn't a therapy session," he repeated, more to himself than anyone. "No, Stephen," Johnny replied. "It's a mirror, and you don't like what you're seeing." The audience exploded. Claps, cheers. Some people stood. The power dynamic had flipped, and everyone felt it. Johnny leaned back again, finally at ease, letting the crowd speak for him. Stephen looked out at his audience, his own crowd, and for the first time they weren't with him. He was losing them, losing grip, losing face. So he did what ego often does when it feels cornered. He lashed out. "You know what?" he said suddenly, his tone now tinged with frustration. "If you don't like it here, maybe you shouldn't have come. Nobody forced you to sit in that chair." Johnny's eyebrows rose, amused. "You're kicking me out now?" Stephen held up his hands, mock surrender. "Hey, I'm just saying, maybe we're not a good fit." Johnny stood, slowly, deliberately. The room froze. "I came here in good faith," he said, "to talk about art, film, maybe even have a laugh, but you weren't interested in any of that." Stephen crossed his arms, defensive now. "I was interested in the truth." Johnny turned to the audience, addressing them directly. "Then here's the truth," he said. "There are two kinds of people in this industry. Those who risk everything to be real, and those who risk nothing to feel clever. He turned back to Stephen. And I'd rather be torn apart for my truth than applauded for your script. Stephen didn't speak. Couldn't. The crowd roared, and as Johnny walked off stage, the cameras kept rolling. And Stephen Colbert, for the first time in years, looked genuinely small behind that desk. But the story wasn't over yet. Because what Johnny did next, off-script and unplanned, would make headlines around the world. Johnny Depp didn't storm off the stage. He didn't yell. He didn't slam a chair, throw a tantrum, or give the tabloids the meltdown they were hoping for. No, he walked, calmly, with the slow, controlled grace of a man who had endured much worse than a smug talk show host and a badly rehearsed ambush. Stephen Colbert sat frozen at his desk, hands clenched together in front of him, failing to hide the tremor in his voice as he called out, "Johnny, come on, don't be dramatic. You're walking away from a conversation." Johnny stopped, but he didn't turn around, not yet. The audience was holding its collective breath. No band, no laughter, no lighting cue, just silence. Then Johnny turned, slowly, and looked directly into the camera. The moment was surreal. He wasn't looking at Stephen anymore. He wasn't even addressing the audience in the studio. He was talking to everyone watching at home, everyone who had followed his journey through headlines, courtrooms, whispers, and gossip. Everyone who had watched from afar as his legacy was ripped apart and reassembled. And now he was speaking to them. "You tuned in tonight expecting a show," he began. "Maybe a few laughs, maybe a redemption arc, maybe a clever line or two." His voice was low, deliberate, every word soaked in quiet conviction. But what you saw was something else entirely. Stephen shifted behind the desk, visibly uncomfortable. The camera stayed on Johnny. "You saw what happens when someone decides to wear truth instead of polish. You saw what happens when a man walks into a room expecting dignity and is greeted with mockery instead." A few audience members clapped. It wasn't orchestrated. It wasn't prompted. It was honest. "You know," Johnny continued, "I've made mistakes. I've lived a life that's been messy, imperfect, and entirely my own. But I've never worn a mask I didn't know how to remove. I've never stabbed anyone in the back and called it journalism. I've never used someone else's trauma as punchline material." He turned to Stephen now. No anger, just clarity. "You wanted a viral moment, Stephen? Here it is." Colbert opened his mouth to speak, but Johnny raised a hand. "Let me finish." The power in the room was no longer Stephen's. It hadn't been for a while. "I was invited here to talk about my art, my work, my film. But from the moment I sat down, I knew something was wrong. The smile didn't reach your eyes. The jokes were knives with sugar on the tip." The audience murmured in agreement. Several nodded. Some clapped again. But I stayed. I stayed because I believe that even flawed people deserve to speak. I stayed because I've spent years having others speak for me, twist my words, rewrite my story. And I thought maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. He took a breath, then added, "But it wasn't." Colbert leaned forward, microphone still live. "Johnny, this isn't personal. This is just what we do. It's TV." Johnny smiled sadly. "And that's the problem." Another pause. It was no longer just tension. It was transformation. "This isn't about me being a guest on a show," Johnny said. "It's about a system that disguises cruelty as comedy, that packages humiliation as content, that celebrates the downfall of artists more than their rise." He turned to the audience once more. "If you've ever been talked over, misunderstood, laughed at when you needed to be heard, this moment is for you." The crowd erupted, not in laughter, but in applause, leaking loud and unprompted. Stephen sat in stunned silence. His team behind the cameras looked panicked. Someone was whispering into his earpiece, but he didn't respond. Johnny walked back toward the edge of the stage. Stephen stood. "You can't just walk off like this." Johnny paused again. "I'm not walking off, Stephen," he said. "I'm walking out, on the idea that entertainment requires humiliation, on the notion that ratings matter more than respect." He looked into the crowd, then back at the camera. "To everyone watching at home," he said, "thank you, not just for tuning in, but for seeing through the noise. You've stood by me through storms I never asked for. And tonight you stood again, not for gossip, not for scandal, but for dignity. Then with a final nod, he walked, not rushed, not angry, just done. Stephen stood there alone behind his desk. The band didn't play. The crew didn't cue applause. The audience sat in stunned silence. Many of them now turned against the host who had gone too far. One camera stayed on Stephen's face, tight shot, and for the first time you could see something rare in a late-night host. Defeat. His smile had vanished. His posture slumped. His cards, useless, were crumpled in his hands. He muttered something like, "We'll be right back." But even he knew there'd be no recovery tonight.